أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. In the name of God, most merciful, ever merciful, and may God's peace and blessings be upon His holy Prophet Muhammad and the purified members of his household and progeny. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajjal farajahum. Sisters, brothers, viewers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. And thank you for joining us once again in our Life, the Islamic Answer series, in which we try to extrapolate the teachings of Islam from the Holy Quran and the narrations of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam to learn how to live in this complex and fast-changing world of ours. The theme that we have been discussing is that of knowledge and reason in Islam, and we had reached the topic of the community. Within the community, we said that there are a number of different subtopics or subjects that we want to cover. After explaining the importance of the community of knowledge, establishing the idea that there is such a thing not only as a Islamic community or a community of people who come together around a common belief, we said that there are also sub-communities or smaller communities within the larger community, and one of these is the community of knowledge. People who come together in Islam around the idea, the importance of knowledge, of sharing knowledge, acquiring knowledge, and improving knowledge, and building a world within the community around the importance of knowledge. There are specific groups of people that belong to this community that have been highlighted in Islamic teachings. Some of these include children, as we saw in a number of narrations, and of course the learner and the teacher, and then everyone else. We said that in Islamic teachings, everyone has to find a place for themselves within this general notion of the community. But there's also special attention that we need to give to a few more categories of people, groups of people. One of them is women, and we discussed the role of women in a community of knowledge, specifically from that angle of knowledge. And we also discussed the role of the family as one unit contributing to and participating in the communities of knowledge. And the next discussion that we had brought us to the idea of the intellectual. And we said that this is a very perhaps different, uncommon topic to discuss in these types of discussions. What do we mean by the intellectual, and why are we discussing the role of the intellectual within the community of knowledge? First, we defined the intellectual very broadly for our purposes for this discussion as a person who carries a type of expertise or knowledge in non-Islamic studies or non-Islamic fields. So they are not an expert in Islamic sciences. They may know a little bit, they may know a lot about Islam and its various sciences, but they are not an expert in Islam in any of its fields. They may be an expert in any other field. They may be an accountant or an engineer or someone working in business or so on and so forth. They are not an expert in Islam itself. This is how we are defining the person who falls in this category of the intellectual. So quite broad. This person may want to participate, have interest in participating in the work of the community at a cognitive level, at an intellectual level. They want to think about how should the community be shaped? How should the community work together? How should it be structured? What should be its programs? How can it improve in the future? And so on and so forth. And then, of course, in addition to this, there should be some sort of action, actual work that the person does, contributing perhaps only at the level of the intellectual activity and the thinking and the analysis, but beyond that too. perhaps contributing, participating in committees, participating in projects, and so on and so forth. This is, in short, who we are talking about when we talk about the intellectual. So, of course, within this, we can have the intellectual that everyone agrees around. If we say someone, for instance, is a professor at a university, of course, everyone will agree that this is an intellectual. When we start to say, for instance, perhaps someone is an engineer, it's on the fence whether everyone would consider them to be an intellectual or not, because now we're starting to go away from activities of pure thinking in society. They may or may not fall in that social class. So we have defined it in this very broad way, and we will come back a little bit later in the discussion to see perhaps how some others have talked about, especially in the West, how they have defined the intellectual. And we will have to come back to this way of understanding who is the intellectual when we talk a little bit later in the discussion about the relationship between this intellectual and Islamic expertise. And this is what we are trying to get to, right? But we said before we jump into this, we need to understand, why is this even a relevant topic? And we need to start by giving a little bit of the context. The main question that we are trying to understand is, what is the role of the intellectual for our purposes in the community? But there's a bigger discussion that already exists in society. What is the role of the intellectual in society? And this can take two versions for us. It can be in society in general, because this is what we find, for instance, in the West, or it can be specifically in Islamic society. And the truth is, in both cases, there is a lot of scholarship that already exists related to the question of the intellectual. Who is the intellectual, and what is the role in both the Western world and the Islamic world? But we said the context for this discussion, the context for these questions is different. And the question was asked, and thinkers started to think about this and write about this and lecture about this earlier in the West. And there's a reason for this. Because they dealt with questions and issues where they were confronted to a new reality in the world that happened in the Western world much sooner than it happened in the Islamic world. And so there was no need in the Islamic world yet to discuss who is the intellectual and what should their role be. But in the West, this became a reality. And so you see their thinkers start to think about this and write about this and lecture about this. And so what we tried to do the last time that we met is to start to think about and try to understand what was the context in the Western world that forced them to start thinking about the intellectual. Who is the intellectual and what is their role? And we said, when we asked the question, what is the role of the intellectual? It can mean two things. And this is going to be important for our later discussion. First, it can mean, what is the role that the intellectual is actually performing in society? Or it can mean, what role should the intellectual perform in society? Because they may perform a role that is not what their true responsibility is. There's a difference between what they are doing now, what they contribute to, what they participate in, and what they should be participating in. And in truth, this is a difference of discussion. The first one is to describe what is happening. The other one is to provide a moral judgment. Right? You say there is an obligation, there's a responsibility, there's a duty to do certain things. So very quickly, I'll provide a summary. There were people who were not in attendance last week, and we had issues with the broadcasting, and I don't think that it has been put up yet, our recording. So I'll provide a very quick summary of the headings without too much explanation, and then we'll add today. So what we're trying to do now is to look at what was the context in the West that forced Western society to start thinking about and start asking questions about who is the intellectual and what do they do? What does an intellectual do? Then we will ask the same question about Islamic societies. What happened in the Islamic world that forced Muslim thinkers and Muslim scholars to start thinking about this question. Who is an intellectual and what do they do in society? And the main question here is going to be, and what is the relationship with Islam? Do we need intellectuals to participate in and think about Islam, or can we simply rely on the scholars of Islam? Is there now a need to start thinking about beyond the pure expert and scholar in Islam? And we said the implied question under all of this is that we have to decide first, are we of the school of people who believe that Islam has something to say about everything in life, about every dimension in life? Or is Islam strictly limited to the areas of life that have to do with spirituality, religion in the strict sense, our soul and its salvation in the afterlife? So Islam shouldn't have a lot to say about, maybe a little bit about an economic system, but not more than that. Maybe not really a lot about psychology, maybe nothing about biology, maybe nothing about anything that we can understand and study and reach and conclude based on what God has given us. He has given us reason, He has given us the senses. We can study the world, explore it, understand it, reach conclusions. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us tools for this. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has not given us tools to understand, how do I enter paradise in the afterlife? Therefore, I need the tools from the outside because I don't carry them internally. My reason cannot tell me. Therefore, I need details. So religion comes and says, I need you to fast and to pray and to perform the pilgrimage, because that's how you show worship to God. He wants to be worshipped in a specific way, not in general how you decide to worship Him. Right? And if you remember the series, for those who were part of the series, when we explained the lessons on beliefs, we explained this is one of the main reasons why we need religion, because it provides sources of knowledge that cannot be provided by any other tool. But what about the rest? What about those areas that seem to be common between what revelation can say something about and what our reason may be able to reach in terms of conclusions? There are things we know that reason cannot reach. Reason cannot reach by itself on its own a lot of the things, a lot of the details that we find. For instance, what is awaiting us after death? No one knows. There is no amount of reasoning and analysis that can reach a detailed conclusion about this question. There is very high level conclusions that we can reach. You have to say that if you believe that there is a creator, a designer to this world, therefore there must be justice that is provided based on how you lived in this world awaiting you in the afterlife. That's the most you can reach based on reason. The details of that, nothing is necessary. It could be one way or another. Where do I get the details for this? What tells me how do I have to live in this world so that I can maximize, optimize my benefits in the afterlife? I can't reach that conclusion based on reason alone. And that's why I need religion. I need something outside of reason. But what about all those other areas in life where reason seems to have a lot to say? Anything related to medicine or engineering, or how social life should be organized, political life, economic life, and so on and so forth. Does Islam have a lot to say about these fields or not? If you believe that it does not, as some people do, as some even scholars do, then you may not be interested too much in this discussion. Because you would say that the intellectual is the one who works in their areas of expertise, and the religious scholar works in the areas of their expertise within religion, and everything stops there. But if you believe that religion has a lot to say about every aspect of life, every dimension of life, and that the world is changing quickly, it's no longer a traditional world where there was something very clear-cut called religion, and you know where to find it and the answers that it can provide. If you happen to be living in a minority situation, You are a small community in a much bigger society that does not believe the same things you believe, does not hold the same values you hold, where things are blurred between who is an expert in what and what they can contribute to a community, then this discussion becomes a lot more relevant and a lot more important. So clearly, I'm not going in that discussion, but I'm saying implied, I'm already giving the answer of what we believe and how Islam has a lot to say about every aspect of life. Not to the same degree, but it has things to say about every aspect of life. There is a way to live that we call Islamic. It may not be strict, it may not be detailed. Islam will not come in family life and provide details about every dimension of the family life, but it will give general instructions. It will give you a general sandbox with general principles. If they are respected, this is considered an Islamic way of living your family life. There are other areas. No, if you go to how to perform your prayer, you're going to have very fine details. This is how you perform your ruku'. This is how your back should be. This is how your hand should be placed on your knee while you're performing your ruku'. This is where you should look. This is how long it should take. This is what you should say. This is very detailed. We may not find this level of detail in every aspect of life. But generally speaking, in the different dimensions, does Islam have something to say about them or not? And it's in those other dimensions that I'm going to be interested to hear, because Islam is going to say, generally speaking, this is what family life should look like. And today I have experts and therapists and counselors and advisors and mental health experts and doctors and biologists and sociologists and anthropologists who also have a lot to say about how family life may be or should be. Do I only rely on the 17 ruwayat that I have and I close the door to everything else and I say this is Islamic and it covers all of my needs in society? Or do I need to look at who else has said what? And what do I take? And what do I reject? What do I accept based on what criteria? Do I listen to these experts or not? Really, that's what we're asking. This is one field, and we can apply this to every dimension and every angle and every aspect of life. And this is one type of discussion to have when you are living in an Islamic society. It's another discussion to have when you are living as a very small minority, sometimes a minority within a minority, in a much larger ocean of very different values and ideological currents, ways of thinking and understanding the world. Very different than what you hold. So that discussion becomes a lot more relevant, a lot more important. In any case, inshallah, all of this is clear now. That was the introduction that we tried to cover a little bit last time that we met. And so we said, obviously, one thing that we keep in mind before jumping into this is that depending on how we answer this question of the role of the intellectual, since we're talking about the community, and we stepped a little bit outside of purely the community of knowledge to community in general, which in truth is one and the same thing. But this is going to affect, depending on the role that we are going to ascribe to the intellectual, it is going to affect the structure of that community. Because we're saying that there is one more ingredient that we have to make sure is there, present, with a defined role, the intellectual, which will affect the structure, the workings, the governance of that committee or that community. In any case, so what we covered last time, without going into too much detail, so that inshallah we can get to what we were trying to start today. We said the discussion in the West began with the rise of rationalism in the West, or the Enlightenment. So you go back to 17th century and onwards, and you have a group of people who, because of a very long accumulation of events and things that happened in their societies and how their societies are structured, and the type of oppression and injustice and poverty and misery that many of these societies were living in, they revolted against the what was called the traditional structure of society, the traditional way of living in society, which was, as we said, based on revelation and religion and the church state as the authority. All of that was thrown out and replaced with, this is the Enlightenment, replaced with reason, science, and the individual, which led to democracy and everything related to the individual and individual rights and human rights and so on and so forth. This was the first step. And those who led this charge were the philosophes, as they called them, right? Voltaire and Montesquieu and Diderot and others. Maybe another time we'll talk in detail about what they left. Until today, many people think that Rousseau is one of the main thinkers of this. And until today, the intellectual is represented by who he was and his thoughts and what he left behind as a legacy. The same thing we find in others. And that generated a whole discussion that goes on until today about, can the intellectual be religious or do they have to be secular? Because of this legacy that came from that time of the Enlightenment. This is what started the whole discussion. We're changing the entire structure of society, how we think, where we find our truth. As we said, you let go of revelation and religion and the church, and you replace them with what you can do alone as a human being, with your own thinking, so reason. And the main tool you're going to rely on is going to be science, empirical science, mathematical empirical science. And it's all about you as an individual. Therefore, your happiness, therefore you're the only matter. You're the only thing or one or entity that matters. So if all of that is the case, then I have to rethink society. I have to rethink the role of the intellectual in that society. The intellectual was kind of on the margins before. But if this is how things are shifting, you get rid of the clergy, you get rid of those who are running the state as an extension of the sovereign, of the monarch, of the king and queen, and you're going to replace all of that with the intellectual. That was a 180. It was a revolution. And then this began a whole series of events. And they're all related, and we don't have time to link them and show how they are related. Inshallah, it's clear in a lot of ways. Followed by 18th and 19th century, we said the Industrial Revolution. Now you are able to use heavy machinery to perform the work that had to be done by manual labor. Which means that there are people who had the means to own this machinery and to own the land and to own the buildings where all of this is being done. And so they made all the money. And for all of this to work, you need hordes and masses of people. And so you have a working class who is provided just enough to continue to be a working class, and those who own the means of production, those who own the land and the machinery and the buildings and they are the ones who create the system and the laws and the structure that ensure that this remains the case forever. And those who do not have continue to not to have. And this perpetuates in time through a legal system and an educational system and a social system and a religious system and so on and so forth. And so the intellectuals of that time start to think about, why is this the case? Why are we ending up, even though society is supposed to get better because of the Industrial Revolution, things should get a lot easier and a lot better for human beings. They're not. The majority of the people are now living under the standard of poverty and causing more and more oppression and more misery and more injustice in society. What is happening? And this is where you end up with the thought that comes from people like Marx, with Marx being the most famous one. This is his main concern. And so they start to analyze and to try to understand what is going on. In his case, the solution is we have to criticize capitalism. Capitalism being a system that favors the capitalists. The capitalists being the ones who own the capital, the means of production, the means of generating wealth and power in society. And so he has to find a way to break away with that system, to make room for those who do not have to eventually have. So he's calling for a revolution. He's telling the working class, do not remain a working class. You are much more powerful than you think. But you're being blinded by a system that is being imposed on you and you're just going along with it. There's a way to break away with this. That was his idea. But he thought the revolution would take place in Europe because they are the industrially advanced nations. The revolution happened, and this was the next one, in Russia. Which shows that he was completely mistaken in his analysis. But in any case, that's a completely different discussion. But the way he thought about all of this will remain the case until today. Because he's trying to identify what is the role of the intellectual. How is the intellectual contributing to this system that is oppressing some people and helping others? Is the intellectual doing what they're supposed to do? They're going to have to pay a price if they criticize the system, if they go against the capitalists. But is that their duty or not? Slowly we start to find the discussion around the duty and the responsibility of the intellectual. Led to the rise of nationalism and the nation state. The world is changing. There are more and more states appearing. And we're really starting to talk about states as opposed to just extremely large empires as it used to be before. And this forces the discussion on what is the role of the intellectual in the state. How important is nationalism? That we all unite together because of the geographic and political borders that we have created. And if you criticize the state, are you a traitor? Or is that your role? And so you have a large discussion happening. And this is where you have to put the thought of someone like Nietzsche, a very big philosopher who's thinking beyond the state. State is one more way of controlling people's minds and limiting human beings, and so we have to think much bigger. And you have those who go against it, and you find it today. This same discussion is still ongoing, by the way. Then, we talked a little bit about the Russian Revolution, and this is where you start to have a lot of thinking about what is called cultural hegemony. The way to control and force only one way of thinking. How is this created? Can it be created without intellectuals participating in it? You need tools that only the intellectuals possess to be able to create that. A culture that forces the masses, all of them, to move in one direction. Should they contribute to this if they are told that this is in the benefit and the interests of the nation? Or should they criticize this and stand up against it and say, we see what you're trying to do. Others may not, but we see it right away. We can analyze it. We can criticize it. We can expose it. And so we have thinkers at that time, in that period, who started to emerge on both sides. And many of them started to fall under oppression and huge injustices committed against them because of this. Because they spoke up. They analyzed. They started to identify the tools, the structures of power, and how to put them in place and how to break away from them. Okay? Maybe later in the series we come back to this. Then we get to the two world wars. World War I, World War II. I've talked enough about these. I don't need to give too much explanation here except to say that these wars proved what a lot of thinkers had started to think about and to perhaps criticize shyly, and they were not really getting any traction. That progress or change is not automatically and necessarily good. The Industrial Revolution that eventually leads to a lot of scientific progress is not automatically good. We have to add something else to it to ensure that it remains good. And the proof came in World War I and then World War II. This was the result of a lot of scientific progress. A lot of scientific and technological and industrial progress. But when it is without any values, without any ethics or morality, without any other principles, it's blind progress, it could be easily used in the way that it was used in World War I and much worse in World War II. And this created what was called the crisis of civilization. We are no longer sure what it means to be a civilization. The devastation that happens in the world after World War I and especially World War II means that everything we thought we knew about what it means to be a civilization is out the window. And this is where you start to see a lot of works coming out to criticize science and to criticize technology and to criticize modern times. You have works like The Decline of the West and other works. And you also have a lot of thinkers now obsessively and focused on the darker parts of the human being, like Freud and others. They're trying to understand and make sense of what would get human beings to act in this way. Savage, barbaric way that leads to a World War I and a World War II. Okay, so of course, with all of this and where are the intellectuals in all of this? Could any of this have been possible without the intellectuals or not? This goes on. We move to the Cold War. After World War II emerges two superpowers who are both trying to increase their power, increase their grip. With more and more states joining one or the other, it becomes impossible for a state to stay in limbo and not to ally itself to either on the side of the USSR or the side of and the Soviets or the United States. And that tension in the world was called the Cold War. It's not an actual war, but there's enmity and hatred and conflict, which created another situation for the intellectuals. It put them in a dilemma that it was no longer possible to just be a neutral intellectual. No matter what you said and no matter what you did as an intellectual had to fall in one of the two categories. You are either with us or against us. So everything is reinterpreted that way. And that's the dilemma that this caused. And sometimes in today's world we still find this. So something to keep in mind. We keep going. Then we have the post-colonial or decolonization of the world. The world used to be colonies. You had superpowers before World War II that had collapsed as these dominant superpowers, like the UK, the United Kingdom, that had colonies everywhere, Canada and elsewhere. The same thing was happening in Africa, same thing was happening in the Middle East, same thing was happening in elsewhere. The people were rising in India very famously and were asking to become an autonomous state. I no longer want to be your colony, to be colonized by you. I want to become my own entity, politically and socially and religiously and linguistically and so on and so forth. And here emerged the whole discussion on what that means. What is the role of the intellectual before? When you suddenly realize that you have been colonized, what is the role of the intellectual? Because the intellectual can very easily fit into the work, the mandate, the benefits of being close to the colonizer or the empire, as opposed to joining with those who are trying to stand up against. And so this is where you see a lot of the discussion and a lot of the thinking around this. And this is extremely important for the Islamic world, which until today is a hot topic. In any case, so I'll continue. This can take us very far. The cultural revolution of the 60s and beyond, social cultural revolution. So this is when you start to have social activism. People who rise asking for rights that traditionally they have not had. This is where you see the emergence of the real movements, civil rights movements and feminism and other movements. It's during this phase. And once again, we're trying to see what is the role of the intellectual during this time. Who do they join with? When you have anti-war movements, there are intellectuals who said, this is when Chomsky rises and becomes Chomsky. He says, my role is to expose the narrative that is being used, because this war is not about what you are being told it is about for Vietnam. And we're going to come back to Chomsky a little bit later. And then, of course, you have all the other intellectuals who criticize this position and who say that this goes beyond your duty as an intellectual. This is not your place, nor your right, nor your responsibility. This is not your field. Stay in your field. Stay in your lane. And this is a very important topic. Chomsky's a linguist. What he is criticizing, initially, there seems to be linkages. Manufacturing, consent, and other critique is based on communications, which is very close to linguistics. He has the tools, and he has when he keeps going further and further away, it means clearly that he is now stepping outside of his pure lane of expertise into social engagement and social activism now. And this is a discussion of the responsibility or the duty of the intellectual. What allows them to play that role? Is it justified or not? Is it expected or not? Any case. So this is where we see a lot of the movements led by Malcolm X, Michel Foucault, and others. And then we have, starting in the 90s, mostly it becomes very clear, globalization. So this is neoliberal thinking. This is the old capitalist way of thinking in a modern way. So neoliberal. It's not just the liberal system, it's the new liberal system combined with what technology allows. And it allows to spread it and make it dominant everywhere else in the world. You used to be contained and limited to the space you're working. I live here and I can become a capitalist here. I can impose what I want to impose here. Geographically limited space. What technology allows me to do is take this beyond this space to anywhere else in the world, which leads to those who can to globalize the world, and that's globalization. My merchandise can take over, my laws can take over, my thinking and structure and systems and education and so on and so forth can take over, so that all of this serves me. And this is globalization. Of course, I'm presenting the critical aspect of it to save time. And so you add to this what technology allows, which mainly shook the foundations of what it means to be an expert or an intellectual. Knowledge becomes something democratic, the democratization of knowledge, they call it. Which means what? Which means that it's no longer only in the hands of the elites. You, from your home, without any education, can have access to the same studies and the same research if you wanted to, and you have the time and you have the effort and you have the will. You can have access to the same information as this person who is now finishing, their postdoc for the 15th year in university in their area of research. So what's the issue? If you end up having a conclusion about a topic that is different than theirs, you without any education but having access to the same knowledge, the same information, the same data that they do. And this created the crisis of expertise. Do we still rely on experts? Or is it a lot more democratic now? Do I need the expert like I needed them before? When there's an information overload. The value that information used to carry is no longer the same. And therefore the value that the expert has, because they were supposed to be the unique entry point and exit point of the knowledge or the information or the data, that's no longer the case. Their value now changes in society. So that means I have to think completely differently about who is the intellectual. What role do they carry? Do they have to be an expert in the academic sense or not? And that's, as I mentioned last time we met, it created what was called, for instance, the death of expertise. And some are completely with that, and they say that's a good thing. This is where society has to move. We cannot rely on the blind biases of the experts who are all trained to think the same way and act the same way and so on and so forth. And there's a lot more good thinking and marginal thinking that needs to be taken into consideration. And those who say, of course, all of this is wrong, and we have to come back to a system where the experts are the experts, period, and nothing more. And we're not taking position here. We're saying simply, once again, this brings directly the discussion about the role of the intellectual and its relevance in general in Western society to the forefront. I think that's what we covered last time. So now let's build a little bit on this. I won't have time, maybe I will, we'll see, to cover what I wanted to now show. So this happened, I took you from the Enlightenment, 17th century, around then, to today. Just the big milestones, socio-economic and political milestones that happened in the Western world that forced them to constantly rethink and add to this question of who is the intellectual and what is their role in society, what should their role be in society. These are very big milestones in their world, and this started before what was happening in the Islamic world. These are completely fundamental changes that were happening in the Western world. Now we come to the Islamic world. Without going into too much detail, in the Islamic world, we've had empires. We had the empire of Bani Umayyah, the dynasty of Bani Umayyah, followed by the dynasty of Bani al-Abbas, followed eventually by the dynasty, I'm not going to go into too much detail, eventually by the dynasty of the Uthmaniyin, the Ottomans. All of this represented the traditional way that Muslims were told this is how the state works. And so therefore within that state you have all of your systems that you're accustomed to. This is how education works, this is how the economy works, this is how politics works, this is how religion works. Everything you could think of, there is a traditional way of doing things. No matter where you are in the Islamic world, you are within that empire, which is kind of generally speaking being run in the same way. Whether you happen to be in Cordoba in Spain, or you happen to be in Africa or the Middle East or close to China. All of that is the Islamic world. And so it's being run in a similar way, and it's being managed in a generally speaking traditional similar way. What happens to the Ottoman Empire? It starts to decline. After one battle, the Battle of Vienna, almost at 1680 something, I think 83, the Ottoman Empire starts to fade. That was the beginning of the end. So between 1700 and about 1900, you have the slow collapse of the Ottoman Empire. This created a crisis in the Islamic world. The only system that you've known is now starting to crumble. The system that held everything together. This is not to say that we think that it was a efficient or good or perfect system in any way, shape, or form. But to the Muslims in general, this is the world that they knew. They knew the Ottoman Empire. And they had never known anything different. Nor did they consider anything different to be Islamic. They were told that this is what an Islamic society looks like. This is what an Islamic state looks like. This is what Islamic systems looks like or look like. So, this happens when the exact date officially is 1922. There's no more Ottoman Empire at that point. Now the world starts to get fragmented in the Islamic world, and here we start to have the whole discussion of what does it mean to have a national identity? Now you're going to belong to a nation. You're no longer a citizen of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is being cut up into smaller pieces, and new lines are being drawn on the maps with nations. What does it mean to have a national identity? How is my national identity different than yours? We've been one for centuries. Now suddenly we are two different nations, with my interests and yours, with my resources and yours. In any case, so that begins a whole discussion on what it means for all of this to make sense for us as Muslims and so on and so forth. slowly thereafter, the same discussion about colonialism and imperialism starts to take place in the Islamic world. The Islamic world was completely colonized afterwards. The colonization had already started. And until today, it's very clear, if you look at the Islamic world, you can say which countries were colonized by which empires, right? Which ones were under the domination of the French? Which ones were under the domination of the English? Which ones were under the domination of Italy and Spain and so on and so forth? Very clear. And this is still very visible until today. At that time, there's a whole discussion that begins. The whole same discussion that we had in the rest of the world. One, what does it mean that I become a nation? And two, what does it mean that I'm trying to get away from being a colony, a mere colony of an empire, to becoming my own autonomous self? So the intellectuals begin to question the erosion of their cultural heritage and what it means that there are values and norms that are not yours that are being imposed on you from the outside. The next movement is the Islamic reform movements. So when the Ottoman Empire collapses and new states are being built, and the Muslims are starting to see that it's as though Islam failed, Islam was not able to maintain all of this. There are different thinkers who started to come to the forefront to come up with explanations for this. And the main traditional explanation is that the reason this happened is because Muslims were no longer following the teachings of Islam, even though other thinkers came up with a different theory, which is the root cause of this is Islam itself. Islam itself is no longer able to modernize itself and adapt itself to the modern world. It's moving too fast for it. It was never meant for this type of complex world. It was meant for a more traditional world, a more medieval world. But generally speaking, the big movements that started to appear at that time, this is when you start to see the rise of Salafism. The reason why all of this is happening to us Muslims is because we have let go of the pure, true teachings of Islam. We therefore have to go back to the ways of the ancients. The closest we can get back to the teachings of the Holy Prophet and those who lived at his time. So we have to go back to the time of the Salaf, the companions of the Prophet and those who came right after them, the next generation. That's the rise of Salafism, the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood. The same type of thinking, different tools, different approaches, that we want to benefit from what the West has to offer while maintaining our Islamic identity, or the West cannot offer anything beneficial. And so we therefore have to cut ourselves off and be insular and only stick to what was our reality centuries ago. These are different ways of looking at things. In any case, we continue. I don't have time to explain the intellectual engagement and what they tried to do, the big theories that emerged. We're going to come back to that a little bit later. There are events that start to take place in the world. Clearly, the Islamic world is in crisis. We don't know what to do. So there are movements of reform to Islam itself, and then there are movements of cultural reform. What we need to do is to improve our education systems, our cultural thinking. And so there's very big movements, and this is called the Nahda. If you hear about the Nahda in the Islamic world, this is when the Nahda appears. A lot of the intellectuals were now coming back to the most important thing that can unite us and improve our state in the world. For instance, one theory was Arabic language. It will allow us to go back to our genius and to our strength and to our power, because it will unite us around one language, which will unite us around many other things. And that will bring us back to our golden age and our golden ideas. And so there are these very big movements that appear at that time. How do we reform our education systems? And how do we reform our cultural thinking, and so on and so forth? At the political level and beyond that, everything that happened, I'm going by chronology, everything then that happened around the creation of the State of Israel. That created a gigantic crisis in the Islamic world, and it had a domino effect. Especially after, in appearance, countries from the Islamic world get together and go to war against this new entity. And they lose the 6-day war. That created a crisis in the Islamic world. So the thinkers have to come back and say, what is happening? Why is this the case? What do we need to do to fix? So there's another movement of revival. And here you have different theories. One of them that has started right before, as we said, the one that is trying to say we have to go secular. We have to go away from religion. We have to work on science and education and improving the material and resources that we have. And there are those who said, and this was the predominant movement at that time. And that's why if you look at the Islamic world, you see that during that time, all those who were becoming the heads of state and all those who were ruling and those in positions of leadership, they were secular. They were movements of secularization. And you have very clear examples of this. This is all for the sake of reform and improving and getting better, because clearly the solution is not in Islam. And then this happens, and all these states are not able to even defend themselves. And in 6 days, a new entity is able to establish itself. So this created a domino effect that led to a revival of Islamic thinking. We tried the non-Islamic way and we failed miserably. It got us nowhere. And so you start to see a rise in the world towards what today they reduce and simplify by simply calling it Islamist movements. Movements that are considered too fundamentalist. It's a return to the only alternative that they knew. We tried the other option and we failed miserably, the non-Islamic version. We failed even more. We were doing better with Islam. We're going back to Islam. And so in society you see Islam rises again. And organized Islamic work starts to rise again. And then what gave it its tremendous success and momentum is the revolution in Iran. That showed proof that it can be successful. And so this pushed a lot of the other organized thinking around Islam in the world to say, if they can do it, we can do it too. Islam can emerge victorious and be successful and organize itself and run life. We have a living case here. Okay, and so all of this, of course, is all coming with, and what is the role of the intellectual in all of this? I'm skipping, inshallah, this part is clear now and evident, and I don't have enough time. And then we come, of course, to the same things that happened in the Western world, as it was affected much less negatively by globalization and by the rise of technology and the use of technology. This affected the Islamic world much more because they were passive receivers of globalization. It was being done to them. The West was doing the globalizing. The East was receiving the globalizing. It was being globalized. And so this is where a lot of the thinking started to happen. What does it mean that we are being globalized? That our culture, that our identity, that our thinking is being overtaken by a neoliberal system that is allowed to happen because of the technology. And where are the intellectuals in all of this? And this led to, there's now, maybe I'll finish with these two very quickly. Politically and socially, I'm going to skip this one. It doesn't really deserve too much thinking and talking. Considered a small milestone, a blip in milestone standards, but everything that was called the Arab Spring. Okay, so 2010 or so. But then followed by what has been going on for the past 30 years or more, clearly since World War II, very clearly, everything related to the identity crisis. What does it mean to be a Muslim in today's world? Can you still be a true Muslim in today's world? How much can you compromise and still be a Muslim in today's world? Where does your identity come from? What can you negotiate? What can't you negotiate? What is the role of the intellectual in all of this? In determining what is our identity, what does it look like? And so there is an ongoing crisis of identity in the Islamic world. With this, we covered the milestones. This is what happened in the West. This is what happened in the East, in the Islamic world specifically, in terms of very high level, macro level context. Things that are happening that affect, that we may not always think about. When today I sit here and I say, what should the role of the intellectual be in my community? If I don't think about all of this, it means that it's completely cut off from all of this context. And I made this point the last time we met. The reason I presented all of this is that today, us and people like us, when we ask this question, everything that I just described converges in us plus another layer. How? We talked about the Western context because we live in the Western world. We live in a world where this is the heritage. This is what has gone on historically, socially, politically, economically, to get them to where they are today. There's a reason why they think this way. There's a reason why they have ended up at this point, socially and politically and economically, and even religiously. And we happen to live in this reality. But we're Muslims. We live in this reality, but we didn't come with this reality. We came from a different reality. Which one? The second one that we presented. This is the baggage that we carry. This is what has happened in the Islamic world over the past 2 to 3 centuries on our side. This is what's been happening. These constant movements of reform and trying to bring back Islam to its days of glory and failing miserably, one attempt after another, really not having any successes to show, with a few exceptions here and there that are not large scale. And so there's an ongoing discussion at the level of the intellectuals on what it means to be an intellectual in that environment and what can the intellectual do in that environment to help, to improve the situation, to find solutions. And until now, there's no answer. They fall in different categories. The entire spectrum is represented. And there is not a single heavyweight thinker in the Islamic world who has not addressed this question, just so that we understand how present this question is. What do we need to do to revive our case, our state, to become better, to improve? Why are we falling behind? Why are we lagging? Where is the issue? What can we solve? What does the secret ingredient look like? Every serious heavyweight thinker has addressed this question. Some of them with multiple books, many lectures, articles, activism in the Islamic world and outside. There are communist thinkers in the Arab and Islamic world. There are Christian thinkers. There are philosophers, secular. All of them are addressing this question. And many of them, even though they come from very diverse backgrounds, agree on the same types of solutions. But this is for the Islamic world in which they live. But this is the heritage that we carry, whether we realize it or not. This is what we're coming from, and this is why the state of the Islamic world is what it is today. And this is what you come from into this other world that has landed to where it is at this point. And you are a tiny minority in this Western world with that baggage. And because you are in a tiny minority situation, you have to add that layer to your thinking. What is the role of the intellectual in my small minority community as a Muslim living in the West? So with this, inshallah, we covered the context and explained the relevance of why we talked a little bit about this. Inshallah, the next time we meet, we're going to start to present some of the answers that have been proposed on both sides, in the West and by our Muslim thinkers and scholars, to this question. What does it mean and why they talk about this? وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين. I know the topic is a little dense and abstract and complex, and we're trying to simplify as much as we can. Inshallah, it's still interesting and relevant and useful enough by your standards. We'll do our best to keep it that way. And of course, your feedback is very, very useful in steering the conversation where we need it to go, so that we cover this topic as abstract and complex as it is. We can cover this topic in maybe 2 or 3 more lectures, or we can cover this topic in many, many more. I don't want to spend too much time on it. I want to wrap up the topic of the community quickly to move on to the types of knowledge that Islam encourages. But depending on the feedback we get and the interest we get, we can provide more or less detail in the next few lectures, which might make the discussion last a little bit longer. So that was a little note. I should have started with that, but in any case, for a couple of minutes before prayer and then after prayer, inshallah, bil khidmah. But for the next couple of minutes, are there any questions, concerns, comments about anything we covered? Objections, clarifications? تفضلوا. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's fascinating to hear the comparison you made. Not the comparison, but the contextual explanation from the West and the Islamic world. But within the Islamic world, we don't have like one single, kind of baggage, as you called it, right? So we have our different, societies within the Islamic world, and all of them come with their own nuances, right? So are we going to hear from you about those different, nuances and how they develop over time and what they led to and how it is going to shape thinking about the future of the Islamic world?
Yeah, so excellent question. Huge differences and variance between the different Islamic societies today. No, the plan is not to go into any detail about any of them. The plan was simply to present highlights from a couple of scholars and what they have tried to do with this question of the intellectual in the Western world, the Islamic world, and maybe a little bit of a focus at the end, spend a bit more detail, and some of our own scholars have said internally to the school of Ahlul Bayt, alayhim salam, and that's it. Because the discussion is not about that, right? The discussion was simply to wrap up the question of what does a community of knowledge look like, especially in a situation of minority, and I didn't want to leave it hanging since we started to talk about who belongs to the community of knowledge. And to me, it seems that this is a very important and relevant and practical question that is never addressed. I don't know of any cases where it has been addressed, especially in our communities living in the West. What does it mean to say this is the role of the intellectual in the community? What does that role look like? Do they even have a role or not? And as I said, the question may not arise with these words, but our lived experience in our own communities is that there's a very pressing need to address this question. Yeah. Sorry to disappoint. On the side, I'm very interested, and of course, yes. Any questions, concerns, comments in the back? تفضلوا. تفضلوا.
So you mentioned how there are philosophers like Freud who explore or try and figure out why people behave in like dark ways or why they do savage and barbaric things. Is there an Islamic kind of interpretation of those same human behaviors that's more psychology, mental health, or like behavioral, rather than simply just saying it like, oh, that's the devil, you know?
Yes, good question. So, going back to what Freud said, or his main thinking and the impulses that are found in human beings, especially the ones that lead to dark or evil or wrong behavior and where they stem from, is there an Islamic equivalent? We would claim, anyone who has studied a little bit of Islamic philosophy, there was a field within Islamic philosophy called ilm al-nafs al-falsafi, or today they would say, psychology. Okay? And, there are traces of this general thinking that you can find all the way back to Plato and Aristotle that were recycled by Islamic philosophers and thinkers. And of course, they added to it layers upon layers of Quranic verses and hadith to make it into a whole consistent theory. And today, if you want to go into kind of a systematic discussion and study of this, you need to have someone who knows what they're doing. But this is the field called akhlaq. So akhlaq in Islam has to start by understanding the faculties of the soul. And when you study the human soul and its faculties, you are forced to study the 3 or 4 big faculties and what they lead to, what they try to do. And why is it that we find these conflicts or these pull and push within ourselves that, the Holy Quran, for instance, in one verse it says, يا أيها الذين آمنوا ما لكم إذا قيل لكم انفروا في سبيل الله اثاقلتم إلى الأرض. They say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says when you are asked to sacrifice or to spend or to give in the way of God, why is it that suddenly you become heavy to the ground? Right? And it's as though there's like a duality. You can be light and heavenly, or you can be heavy and earthly. And so a lot of our scholars say like it starts here. And both realities exist in us. We're not just a soul, we're also a body and matter. We are matter. We can't say, we can't claim, we can't pretend that we're not matter. We are matter, but we are also a soul. And the soul is primary. We are truly the soul, and we have been given an instrument to act in this world with this body. And in any case, so this opens the discussion to, so what are the faculties, what are the impulses, what are the forces within us? And so this is what is studied in ilm al-akhlaq. And by the way, this was supposed to be, inshallah, if we get to it, this is going to be either the second theme of this series or the third theme. We're in theme 1, we're at lecture 95 today in theme 1. It's probably the longest of the themes, because we said we're trying to rewire ourselves Islamically, and so that takes a little bit longer. Once this is done, so knowledge and reason, we start to ask questions about what does it mean to be a human being according to Islam. And so this brings us to a discussion on what are the faculties within the human soul and what makes us human, what is fitrah, and so on and so forth. Inshallah, all of that will be part of one theme. Inshallah, we make it there. Allah yakhallikum. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين.